On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Tiffany Chandra. She's the Director of People and Talent at Sapphire Ventures. We're going to be talking about program management and talent. We're going to dive in and actually talk about what that actually means within the talent acquisition space. We're going to ask Tiffany how she got into program management, because obviously it's not quite what she was doing before. And we're going to ask her some of those skills that she needed to develop, that she had, that she discovered along her path into program management. And we're going to talk about a few other things that we can fit it in. Tiffany, thanks for being on and sharing.
Thanks for having me, Amir. Excited to be here.
Absolutely. Okay. Before we start, Sapphire Ventures, what do you guys do over there?
So Sapphire Ventures is a venture capital firm, and we focus on investments ranging typically from Series B to pre-IPO. So really at that growth stage after companies have found product market fit. And B2B enterprise SaaS companies are truly our bread and butter. We have about 10 billion in assets under management.
Awesome. All right. So topic, program management and talent. When we first had a conversation around this, it was interesting to me because I don't think a lot of people think about program management when it comes to talent. We all are kind of aware of the basic functions within talent acquisition. So maybe let's just start off at the top. Let's define what we mean when we say program management within the talent space, if you could start there.
Yeah, I think most broadly, if we're defining it, it's kind of the process of managing multiple projects that are aligning to one business goal or one overall objective. And I think that is kind of the definition of it at a very high level. Specifically, when we think about how that relates to talent, we think a lot about the hiring process, right? And all the pieces that go into that. I would say recruiting is definitely more typically aligned to project management over program management. But programs is essentially a bunch of different projects that kind of align into one goal, as mentioned earlier.
Absolutely. What are some of the, so maybe just give us a couple examples, because I think if you're working in talent, we know the various projects, but talk to us a little bit about the groupings. What do you see when you talk about grouping certain projects together?
Specifically, when we think about, let's say, hiring an AE, a lot of the times you're not just working on one rec. If we're thinking about full cycle recruiting, right? You're not just working on one rec. You're working on several different roles that may or may not have overlap. And in order to ensure that we are hitting targets, getting to those key metrics, and getting to those goals aligned to each separate hiring manager, you really do need to manage a workflow of different, stakeholder relationships, governance structures, metric tracking, all of the things that go into a project. And then if you zoom out and you have all of these different projects going on, it can be aligned to the same goal. But if you have several different instances with different workflows, different styles, stakeholders, a step above that is really at a program level. And it might not just include hiring, but it could also include, pieces of actually building out creative structures, strategic initiatives, and thoughts behind certain things that you are initiating, which back at my time at Salesforce is where I kind of got that initial exposure of program management through university recruiting, which is definitely, that was the first foray and kind of the first exposure that I got in terms of really falling in love with program management.
I guess, if I'm a listener and I'm hearing program management, you mentioned university recruiting, Salesforce, I could automatically think, okay, very applicable to big businesses, big companies, lots of moving parts. If you're working at a smaller company, maybe not necessarily a startup, but just a smaller company, what are some of those transferable, program management techniques or skills or processes you've seen that would translate well to a smaller organization as well?
I definitely think, so this kind of applies across not just program management, but I think the talent landscape in general, right? It's number one is stakeholder management and relationship building. I believe that's the foundation for everything that we do in talent. And specifically, that piece of program management applies directly to recruiting and the talent function. So I think the biggest thing is stakeholder management. And what does that mean? It's really understanding what does each stakeholder, what is their motive? What is their priority? What are the goals and the gaps that they have behind, kind of like digging levels deeper? What is it that they are really trying to solve for? And how do we get there? Because each stakeholder is going to have a different approach, a different preference, different communication styles. And so I think at the core of program management and project management, we think about that as like the initial pillar. At least that's kind of how we approached it during my time at Salesforce, MuleSoft, even today at Sapphire. That's really the fundamental. I think the other pieces of program management are also, as I mentioned earlier, governance structures, right? It may or may not be applied in a lot of project management because a lot of the times with recruiting, especially during my time at Salesforce, it's high volume. You need to hit a ton of, these goals, and you have these roles that are top of mind that are all similar but different. And so what I think is really important to do is actually take a step back and look at who actually has ownership for each part of this project, right? Who is owning certain parts of this? Do we have an account manager for this hiring manager versus this task versus this role? I think defining all those levels of governance is actually something that is really crucial and critical, not only to ensure that everyone is aligned, but also because it is much more efficient that way versus the five of us trying to, accomplish all these goals separately. It allows us to really keep things streamlined, keep things process oriented, which also goes back to just, maintaining a very efficient workflow through the project or through the program.
Interesting. I mean, you brought up you said a lot there, and you brought up a ton of questions. So I'm gonna slow down and kind of peel this back because I love this. So during my days in engineering, one of my jobs was a certified Scrum Master. So I was a project manager, Scrum Master, program management. I love this stuff, and I've always questioned and asked the question: why does talent not leverage more standard project, let alone program management techniques, accepted, ways of doing things? Because, as you said, a rec is a project, but it seems like a very, I don't want to say unorganized, but it seems like a lot of moving chaos within that project. I understand why. You mentioned governance, which then to me, I think about accountability. I think about service level agreements. I think about the engineering teams, let's say in this case, you're servicing, who are all very familiar with, let's say, working with a shared services team or DevOps team and having those service level agreements or contracts of what's expected. What's the barrier for us to see more of these techniques that are standard in the teams that we're servicing within the talent space?
I think it's a good question. What I think, and I've only seen, a couple of organizations and what I feel like is kind of that barrier to entry. I honestly feel like a big piece of it is that recruiters are running so quickly, right? They have to, their priority is to ensure that the goals are met, the KPIs that they're kind of held to, those are accomplished. And so, it's interesting that you mentioned that because I do actually feel like a lot of the recruiters that I worked with during my time, and even still today, they love pieces of program and project management. In fact, oftentimes I've seen the transition from recruiter to a project manager or to a program, moving into a PMO. And I think that a lot of folks actually enjoy that piece of assigning ownership, things being a little bit more streamlined, structured, driven towards process versus just the outcome. But it sometimes just feels like if you have 35 open recs, you're not able to really, kind of do all the things that you would want to create a streamlined process because you're running so fast. And so it's not a knock necessarily on, the individual. I think it's more so just the speed in which some businesses are running at, especially if you're, a one person show at a startup or, a smaller organization where you have to have your hand in 15 different things and you just don't have time to be kind of like project tracking, although you're probably doing it on the back end, but not in the most streamlined way.
Absolutely. I agree. And again, I understand the challenges for the internal teams and team of one, team of two, reactive, right? There's a lot of reactiveness within talent because if someone leaves tomorrow, it doesn't matter what your processes are, you're a little bit on fire. I would potentially counter if you're sitting on the engineering team and you have a release and there's a problem with your release, whatever you're doing that day goes out the window, you deal with that release. So there is a reactive component to this I can see from both sides. And I do agree with you. I think a lot of people do this internally within their teams. I don't know if it's properly communicated to the stakeholders and if we are leveraging enough of the common syntax, rituals, available tools so that we slipstream into their day and it makes it easier. Because I think if we use, let's say, I know we're trying to talk about program management, we could, maybe we're mixing in some project management here too, but I think on a program management basis, there's probably going to be some components, let's say, around the interview process that you're trying to roll out. There's some expectations for talent to function correctly. Without those pieces, somebody's job is to go chase them down. That doesn't happen in engineering. There'd be a stand-up daily and there'd be accountability. When you think about program management and the matrix component of what you do, how do you help hold other teams accountable so that they are actually participating in what you need to get done? If this is that question, I guess that I've gone a long distance to get there, but I hope I didn't lose you.
No. I think that makes a ton of sense. The immediate response that comes to mind, and there are several, but I think the immediate one that comes to mind is setting expectations at the very beginning. Because I think it's really tough to start chasing after folks once a project or a program has started, right? But if you have the attention of the stakeholders in one room, and let's say maybe it's on separate occasions, one-on-one, but at the very start of whatever project or program you're running, one, I think it's having the buy-in of all the folks who are involved. Two is setting the expectation around this is the cadence in which we're going to be communicating. Does this work for you? Or do we need a shift based off of your communication preference, right? But essentially starting off at a very, ground zero, like this is what we're going to do. Are you bought in? Because we need your buy-in in order for this to be a success. I think that's something that, especially at Sapphire, I found to be hugely helpful is if we're running an initiative, because, on the VC talent side, it can be defined very differently as far as this role, which very, very well with all the folks that you've had on this pod. But I would say no matter what initiative we're running, it's super important to have the partners looped in, right? Or if it's something to do with a portfolio company, to have those stakeholders looped in from the get-go versus, hey, we're kicking this off. By the way, do you mind now, getting involved and helping us move towards this goal? I think that's a fundamental principle that should definitely be applied. And that's kind of the first thing that came to mind was stakeholder alignment. Like that has to be foundational to any project or program that you run.
I love it. I think that upfront expectation, I do think, choose words very carefully. I do think talent's very good at knowing exactly what that is. I also feel that talent sometimes, because they believe they're in service of the business, doesn't hold true to it doesn't follow through on that, right? And just like, can I clarify? I've heard multiple talent people for the years tell me they're in service of the business, and I counter with so's accounting, finance, so's engineering, so's marketing. But when there's a project, there's deliverables, there's expectations. People will go to the mat and this is what I need if you don't deliver it. It's not okay, I see. You're too busy. You couldn't get to it. It's okay. When are you going to put feedback in? When are you going to finish your part of this? When are you going to participate, in the stand-up? All these little various pieces that kind of build, the projects built into the program, as you kind of alluded to. It's all those little pieces that kind of build up. And I feel, and again, maybe it's what you said, the upfront expectation isn't delineated and it's not clear that that you're included. This is matrix. You must participate. I mean, obviously, I don't know what the consequences. Obviously we can go escalate it when no one wants that. But how do you enforce that? I guess maybe that's really the question I'm trying to understand within the space is when we are matrixed, cybersecurity people run into this, privacy ethics people run into this. When there's a matrix team, enforcement is very difficult because you're just a dotted line, not a direct report. You don't have control. How do you handle that piece of this when it comes to program management?
Yeah. So kind of going back to the piece around stakeholder alignment and management, I think in order to enforce certain initiatives or, have alignment with those goals, it's exactly that. It's understanding what the goals are at the end of the day, right? Because if a CEO does not care about the end goal, you're never going to be able to enforce this initiative or this program or this, whatever it is that you're working on, because that person might just not care enough to be bought in. So I think, how do we enforce these programs and the accountability? One is making sure that the things that you're aligned to and the end goal, the end state, is aligned with that person's or this organization's end state as well, right? So it keeps on, I feel like a broken record, but I feel like it keeps on going back to stakeholder alignment and just knowing exactly, like having a very clear picture around the give and get. So, we're putting in this energy to kick off this program. If there's no, and maybe this is even like before that step, is where did that idea stem from? Was there a demand around it? Is there a need for this project or program to take off? The answer should be yes before you double down in this. But once that is clear that there is a need around it, enforcing it is really like, I know people say, maybe this is a hot take. I think over communication is good, but I think the right level of communication, depending on your stakeholder, is even better. So, meaning a CEO might be really choosy about, which emails they go through and which ones stick. And if we're overdoing it, then it loses its impact, right? But being able to have that right level of communication and expectation and further enforcing their buy-in to whatever program that we're kicking off, I think that it has to be like a sweet spot. You have to find, and it can be tough because, we have over 100 portfolio companies within Sapphire's orbit, and aligning 100 CEOs and all of their goals is not the easiest thing, right? Like they're going to have all different goals. But I think, to answer your question, this is a long-winded way to say, I think finding common ground across, okay, let's say we're doing a CEO initiative. All of these CEOs have this thing in common. And if you're not sure if that is the case, have a conversation with them or kick off, a 30-second survey to be able to pulse check that and make sure you have the right, you're in the right space, right? But I think finding that common ground, being able to allude back to that, because these leaders are super busy. So alluding back to that and being very crisp and clear about that is the way that we continue to enforce like what our overall objective is and our business outcome. The other piece is, of course, leaning on the partners here at Sapphire, right? Which I feel very fortunate that the Sapphire partners and just the investment team here is super bought into supporting the talent function. And I feel like that's a huge driver of why we're able to impact our businesses and our companies and our stakeholders the way that we are, is because everyone here is just super supportive of being able to help us drive towards that.
I follow the thought process. I really do think, the couple things that you're hitting on really do make sense with obviously knowing the cadence of that communication, the stakeholder engagement, getting that buy-in up front. I think those are all critical, especially at the program level, because the stakeholders in this case are the ones having something delivered to value them. And I think if that value is not communicated, it's hard, right? It's hard to get, I think anyone in their personal life or business life, it's hard to be motivated to do something if you don't see the value. And I think that's just kind of the challenge of getting someone's attention. A lot of what we're talking about, obviously, as when we're talking about the talent function, the people function, there's various characteristics that typically excel. When we start talking about someone that wants to move into one of these roles, right? Maybe they're like, hey, listen, I love that, but I love actually this project component of talent. What are the skills that you've cultivated that are a little bit different, or maybe skills that you need to develop if you would want to make a switch from being in the weeds on the talent people side into like a program role?
So I'll go back to my time at Salesforce and MuleSoft, which I feel very grateful for that opportunity, because I think what the skills that I was able to really double down on in the university role, I'll start off there. That was when I was primarily hiring for MBA PMMs, was one, I think, across the board, talent and programs, as I mentioned earlier, it's the relationship building and the trust is always going to be pivotal. And that's like foundational to both, right? What I did in order to because I knew pretty early on, as soon as I started in recruiting, I was like, wait, I actually love the program side of this. So how do I transition there? And I think it was a year in, I knew that I wanted to pivot into program management. And what I did was kick off and test different initiatives. So I would encourage, I think that skill set of it's okay. Don't be afraid. This sounds so cheesy, but don't be afraid to do something and fail, because that way you really test the things that work and the things that don't. And it's not necessarily directly tied to the hiring numbers, right? So for example, with the MBA PMM program, would kind of strategically map out, okay, these are the top 10 universities that we're going to attend. What are the different ways that we're going to engage with these students? Getting creative around those ideas, being able to put everything down on paper with a project plan, and then say hey, if we did this event before we kicked off this interview, will that, increase engagement, or will that change the way that the bottom of the funnel inevitably, produces the outcomes of higher numbers? I think, just take initiative to do things that are not in the scope of your role. And again, I feel fortunate that I was able to do that with the team and the managers that I had, where they allowed me to test those things. And especially when I officially moved over to the MuleSoft side, right before I transitioned into the office of the CEO at MuleSoft. And that was kind of building out global employee engagement programs and initiatives, specifically with the internship program, and then kicking off the new hire onboarding program. Right before that, I was hiring for MuleSoft sales leaders and sales teams across the US and Canada. And during that, during that role, I was kicking off little initiatives to kind of pressure test. Is this something that we can leverage for recruiting, or is it something that is going to be completely, out of scope? Things like live sourcing, and then streamlining those things, I think was something that was not too far out of our remit, but it was far enough where it's kind of you're polishing up these pieces of literally create spreadsheets, track progress, share it back out to the teams, do a deep dive, almost like that weekly check-in, right? Do a deep dive, then come back to it, iterate on it, share it back out. Those practices, I feel I didn't know the terminology and the verbiage when I was doing it, but looking back on it now, I'm this is what I wish I sharpened up on earlier on. And this is what I would advise folks to dig into if you are interested in moving from recruiting to programs or project management.
And maybe just a follow-up question to that, because I think, that's a great way of kind of making that transition and kind of give us a little background in terms of kind of the skills and whatnot you've needed. When you're in the role, how are you judged differently than when you're hands-on within the space, right? What's some of the metrics? What are some of the objectives? What are some of the goals that you're typically seeing? Are they very different than what you saw as in the trenches, TA person?
I definitely think so. Some of the metrics that we tracked, and I'm going back to at MuleSoft, right? Building out and kind of scaling the global internship program. The KPIs looked very different, as you can imagine, from hiring on, let's say, 5 to 7 sales leaders in the organization. You have a very clear idea of this is the goal of hiring and placements, versus on the program side, it's this one program of kicking off an L&D initiative. What did the turnout look like? The engagement, the post-survey results. Is it meeting exactly what it is that these students need and want more of? Is this feeding into the greater employee engagement survey on the core side? I think the metrics are it feels very different, because almost in recruiting, it feels black and white. And that was part of the reason why I feel I wanted to transition into program management, is because I think recruiters do an incredible job, or a lot of recruiters do an incredible job of relationship building. My issue was that as a strong empath, I get attached to my candidates, sometimes too much so. And so it felt like it was very transactional, right? And that's not what I love doing. In the VC talent role, much more, it's like building relationships and keeping those relationships longer term is table stakes. And so I think within program management, the pieces of like, absolutely, you still have these metrics that you want to hit, but it's not as black and white, I would say, because depending on the programs that you're kicking off, whether it is engagement, whether it's RSVP numbers, turnout, whether it's tying back certain data points of one initiative and feeding that into a second initiative that you're kicking off in tandem, it just feels highly matrixed. And it feels like it's like this web of different data points and different KPIs that you're constantly iterating on. So there's not an endpoint, right? You're constantly iterating and improving on these things that you're tracking in order to make the next program even better. So
I like that a lot, because I think a lot of people who are familiar with the day-to-day within talent, I think people functions are probably listening going, I do a lot of that already. And I actually agree. I think it's one of the hardest jobs. I joke with people, I go, it is far easier, in my recollection, it's been a hot minute, to sit down, write code and deliver against a project than work within talented people, because the dynamic activities day to day are very hard to get your hands on. Whereas in engineering, you've got a sprint set up, what you're working on, unless something's gone wrong. You know what you've got for the next 2 weeks. I don't quite feel as confident within the talent people space that is as easily, considers that. So I think, some of the examples you've, given us, some of the analogies, I think those really hit. I guess maybe just final question, and maybe this is good for people to listen to. When you left, and you always wanted to know, about program management, it sounds like. But I guess some people who are maybe listening to this, there might be a fear or like a worry that I might not translate those skills, because, it's going to be, some things are going to be brand new. Like those first couple of months gapping into the role, how much was it trial by fire? How much was it self-learning? How much was it just, fire hose? Maybe just as a final question, that'd be good to kind of hear your thoughts.
So I'm thinking about my time at MuleSoft, right? Running the internship program. To be very honest, I think leadership did a great job of setting expectations. That role was very ambiguous. I think, and it's personal, I think I thrive in ambiguity because I love being able to figure things out. I love when things are not super defined, because then you have the flexibility, the creativity to be able to really define that for the organization. I feel fortunate that I had incredible mentors in that organization at MuleSoft that gave me enough context and enough feedback that it was trial by fire, to be quite frank, right? But we had enough of the support around that to be able to, like, if I were steering in the wrong way, they would be like, okay, let's like go this way a little bit, right? And so I think there has to be an open, like if you're open to transitioning into programs or like project management, you have to be okay. This was like my first role where I deeply had to sit down with myself and be like, it's okay for me to not get this right away because it's a different role. And allowing yourself to, as I kind of talked about earlier, allowing yourself to try different things, test it. And if it fails, it's okay. But make sure that you don't make the same mistake twice. Learn from all of your failures and take that and iterate on it, right? But I think being able to get a pulse and like lean on the right people. And again, I had the luxury of being able to lean on leaders, but leaning on the right people to like pressure test. Does this feel right? Am I totally off? And ask for feedback. Because I think prior to that, I was like shy to ask for feedback, both positive and constructive. And in that role, it was like, I just jumped in, and again, very grateful for that, but it was like so much ambiguity. This hadn't yet been formally built out. And so I felt like I had so much room to play a little, and then I needed some guardrails around that. And so I was constantly asking for feedback, not just from the people who were helping mentor and manage me, but from all the cross-functional stakeholders. Like I was asking salespeople, marketing folks, SEs, anyone that I was engaging with, I was asking for feedback. And I think that's a clear way of just get a finger on the pulse and be like, okay, this is working well, keep doing that. This is not, let's pivot, So I would say that that's kind of the approach to take. But again, just don't be afraid to take some risks and mess up a time or two, as long as you're not making the same mistakes over and over again.
That's actually fantastic advice, not just for this, but a lot of things. So I think that's great insights. Tiffany, thanks for being on. Thanks for sharing. I know you got to get back to it. Before I let you go, if somebody does want to reach out to you, we talked a lot about project program management within the space. Is there a good way of touching base with you to kind of follow up on anything you said on the show?
Yes, I would definitely say LinkedIn. It's the platform that I think I'm probably most active on. So if you have a question or want to talk more about transitioning a program or project management, just reach out on LinkedIn. But yeah.
Okay. All right. Awesome. We'll make sure we include that in the show notes. Definitely appreciate your time. Thank you for being on. That's it for this episode. We'll be back again. Different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, I think Tiffany did a wonderful job of walking us through the world of program management within the talent space. I don't know if everyone has considered a move into program management. Obviously, the opportunities are there. Tiffany made the transition, learned a lot along the way. I think if you do have any questions, please reach out to her. I think she'd be the right person to ask those follow-up questions too. Also, like, subscribe, comment. Let me know how the podcast is going for you. That's it for this episode. Thank you again. Bye-bye.